Morning. I feel like there's a great gulf affixed between. We got a little cluster over here, and two got one over here. Yeah, that's right. Well, we've got we've got one of our number. I guess Zach has COVID, but that's not making any reason for the rest of us to scurry to our corners, I guess, or whatever. So. Anyway, well, welcome one and all, and I guess we're online. If those who are listening remotely, welcome to you, and glad you could join us. If presuming you are joining us this morning, I'm leaving the mic laying here. Ronnie? Can you hear me well enough back there? There we go. Okay. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Rick, if you would just say a word of prayer for us, please. Amen. Thank you, Rick. Well, today would have been Kenneth's day to teach, had he still been with us, but we fully understand although we certainly miss them, but we're glad to have Mama here with us. Glad to have Sarah here with us. So we've got a very lovely presence from the family here with us. We're studying an entire chapter today. And actually next week, I think Jason has a class next week. He has really 2 chapters. So that's pretty astounding, really. Normally we've been dividing, the designer of study book has been dividing up into a couple of lessons per chapter, but it makes sense the way that it's divided here. A little bit of perspective. Next quarter, we'll be studying 1 Corinthians, presuming that we continue in this series, and there's no reason that we shouldn't. And then in the summer quarter, 2 quarters from now, we will be studying Ezra and Nehemiah, which brings us back. They kind of alternate, but between the Old and New Testament. So that will bring us back really to this sort of geographic area, and the same kind of time frame, and the sequence of kings that we're studying. We studied about, and in particular, right now we're studying, of course, about Xerxes, but they certainly have a close connection. Just a few comments about that, and I think we've said a little bit about this as we've gone along, but just a brief mention here about this sequence of kings. And we're studying now about Xerxes, and he had about a 21 year reign, and of course this is all well before BC, from in his case 483 BC. You see a slightly different dates by different folks, but from 483 BC to 465 BC. But this sequence of kings, this family of kings, began with Cyrus, of course, who was predicted to be king by name, by prophecy. And then following him, there was a period. There was Cambyses, which we have no mention of Cambyses in the Bible. But and then there was a little sort of pretender king for just 6 months or something. But then we pick up with Darius, or Darius, as you prefer. But Cyrus reigned for 29 years, Darius for 36 years, and Darius was the father of Xerxes, And then Artaxerxes reigned for 40 years, and he was the son of Xerxes. So Cyrus, as far as we're concerned, these are the kings: Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, and Artaxerxes. During the when we study Ezra and then Nehemiah, we'll see, especially Ezra mentioned all of the kings, all these 4 kings he mentions actually in Ezra chapter 4. So we'll be seeing that in 6 months or a few months, maybe 4 months or whatever. So, you know, but all of this is covered in some fashion, form or fashion, in the Old Testament. So it's just to give a wee bit of perspective. Let's look now let's start out with Ezra chapter 5, just a few verses at the end for context, sake of context. And of course, we studied this last time, but beginning in verse 15 of Ezra chapter 4, first of all. Ezra chapter 4 first, I'm trying to say. Let's back up a few verses here in chapter 4. Verse 15, then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai. You know, he had sent word. Of course, he can't see her face to face. You know, she's in the harem, the king's harem. Go gather all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants also will fast in the same way, and then I will go into the king, which is not in accordance with the law. In other words, the way we would say that is, it's against the law, right? It's against the law to go in there that way. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and did just as Esther had commanded him. And now chapter 5. Now it came about on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner courtyard of the king's palace in front of the king's rooms. And the king was sitting on his royal throne in the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. When the king saw Esther the queen, standing in the courtyard, she obtained favor in his sight. And the king extended to Esther the golden scepter which was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the top of the scepter. Then the king said to her, what is troubling you, Queen Esther, and what is your request? Up to half of the kingdom it shall be given to you. Esther said, if it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I have prepared for him. Then the king said, bring Haman quickly so that we may do as Esther desired. So the king and Haman came to the banquet which Esther had prepared. As they drank their wine at the banquet, the king said to Esther, what is your request? For it shall be granted to you, and what is your wish? Up to half of the kingdom it shall be done. So Esther replied, my request and my wish is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king, to grant my request and do what I wish, may the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them. And tomorrow I will do as the king says. Let's proceed now. We'll discuss that a little, then we'll go back to to that and pick up with what in the New American Standard is titled Haman's Pride. Interestingly, the late Dr. Warren Wiersbe, in his commentary on Esther chapter 5, he has these sort of little humorous statements or whatever, designations at the beginning. And for chapter 5, he entitled it, A Day in the Life of the Prime Minister, which logically you could call him, right? He was the number one minister, so to speak. And then he says, in which an evil man gathers enough rope to hang himself, which is a pretty good way to say it. He did got entangled in his own trap. Now, let's comment a little bit here on the setting of this palace and the construction here, because it's sort of interesting. Archaeologists have, for many years now, have been doing digs in this area in Susa, the ancient Susa, or Shushan as it's sometimes called. But just to remember how she approached him, said she put on her royal robes and stood, this is verse 5, chapter 5, verse 1, stood in the inner courtyard of the king's palace in front of the king's rooms, and the king was sitting on the royal throne in the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. There's a little bit of explanation about the kind of the layout. When the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the courtyard, she obtained favor, and so on. There's a lot of interesting material and beautiful pictures and so on the web. If you're interested in digging around for a little bit of this, just to see what they've recovered from these digs. But there's one article on the web. It's called "Footsteps: 3 Things in Susa Esther Likely Saw," which is, it's just to take yourself back and think about what you can maybe see now in some respects, but what she would have seen at the time. Just a comment here. Critics today view the book, and this is critics, view the book of Esther as a fanciful court tale, likely written hundreds of years after the purported events. Other scholars have pointed out the author's intimate knowledge of Persian laws and customs, as well as the language of the period. There are at least 30 people in the book whose names have Persian and Elamite origin, as well as 12 Persian loan words, in other words, have been taken from the Persian, which would suggest a date of composition in or near the Persian era. Finally, the specific descriptions of the palace at Susa would indicate that the author was familiar with the layout. French archaeologist Jean Perrault was the director of excavations at the palace of Darius Xerxes at Susa for over a decade. He concluded, "One today rereads with a renewed interest the book of Esther, whose detailed description of the interior disposition of the palace of Xerxes is now in excellent accord with archaeological reality. Given its inclusion in the Septuagint and the historical accuracy of the details contained within, it is logical to accept the book of Esther as an authentic record of Persian history in that period." The 3 things that this author, he could have said more, but mentioned that she likely saw was the palace frieze, F-R-I-E-Z-E, with the bricks and so on, a figure, a drawing, a mosaic made up of bricks. The bull capitals, which were on top of the big pillars in the garden and the inner courtyard and throne room. This is interesting to me, but this palace was first built by Darius. When Xerxes' father, King Darius, built the palace at Susa, he ordered the construction of colorful friezes depicting humans and mythological animals using a combination of glazed and unglazed bricks. And so you look online, you can see some of the pictures. And then the bull capitals, they call it, these were just huge figures with two-faced bulls on the top of these huge pillars in the garden where we first read about here that they were holding this drunken banquet. Each of the 36 pillars of the audience hall was topped with a bull capital. This one they show picture is on display in the Louvre in Paris. North of Xerxes' palace was the audience hall, and these 36 columns were there. And then the inner courtyard, because there's far more information than I have time to mention here. But and then the audience, the hall, the inner court. In Esther 5:1, we read, and he summarizes that, excavations at the palace in Susa have revealed the very spot where these events took place. The palace had 3 courtyards, the large outer courtyard, a middle courtyard, and the inner courtyard. South of the inner courtyard were the king's quarters and his throne room. To approach the king, and this is what she did now, it's against the law, but this is what she did. To approach the king, one had to pass from the outer courtyard through a double guardhouse into the middle courtyard and then into the inner courtyard. Here one makes a left-hand turn and proceeds through the doors into the throne room of the king. And this one doesn't mention it here, but others mention there was a ramp then, and this, of course, was for effect, right? When they made this turn and are looking at the king on the throne, there's a ramp that rises to the throne. So this would be the more striking for the setup here. So that was the setup, and so it certainly the archaeology certainly has underscored the authenticity of this, and also, at least from my standpoint, makes it more perhaps more interesting, and kind of brings it home to us. This is not some fanciful thing that somebody came up with. A comment here from the late Dr. Wiersbe. What Esther did ranks among the great deeds of faith in Scripture and could have been recorded in Hebrews 11. Interesting. It wasn't enough for the Jews to pray and have faith that God would work. Somebody had to act, and so on. And of course she did, and he's lauding her. Of course, Mordecai deserves a great deal of credit, doesn't he, as well? He certainly deserves a great deal of credit because he was urging her on and really taking action. And she said, come what may, basically. I'm going to do this. Come what may, if I perish, I perish. So in verse 1, it mentions the third day. So what? That's the third day of what? Of the fast. It'd be the third day of the fast. They had been fasting, and so this was the last day of the fast. So she would have replaced her mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, mourning garments with royal apparel. I mean, she couldn't go in. First of all, the king didn't know who she was from a standpoint of origin, right? He didn't know she was a Jew. She couldn't afford to go in mourning clothes, right? It kind of reminds me of, was it Nehemiah that asked the king that the king asked what was troubling you? Was that Nehemiah? One of them. You remember that? And then it was because Jerusalem was in such terrible shape, and so the writer says about that he wasn't supposed to go before the king with a sad face, right? So, but here we have her. She's got to put on royal robes. She's got to look queenly when she comes in. And so, and one interesting thing. Now, we just read about this guard house that they had to go through. She's a queen, right? So, the king can do whatever he wants to when she gets there. But these guards, presumably, were not going to stop her, right? I mean, this is the queen. If she wants to go through into the inner court, they're going to let her do it, and the king can make his decision about what to do when she gets there. And then when she got there, verse 2 says, she obtained favor in the sight of the king. Proverbs 21:1 says, the king's heart is like channels of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he pleases. And so we know that kings and all of us are available to God for direction and guidance and use as he sees fit. But maybe the king would have done this on his own accord, but there are too many things that have happened in this book to make it happenstance, right? There's too much. She hadn't seen the king hadn't seen her, more to the point. Hadn't called her in for 30 days. He's got other things, other women, other whatever on his mind, and not her. And so, but he seems delighted, intrigued, interested, whatever, when she comes in, and God's hand had to be behind it. Excuse me. There's just no two ways about it. It doesn't stand to reason otherwise. So certainly that is a situation. An interesting figure, Dr. Wiersbe said that this figure, he says, God was standing in the shadows. That's an interesting way to put it, isn't it? To think that God's standing in the shadow. I think the flood, we got a flood coming here behind me. Standing in the shadows. If the king, so what would have happened if the king hadn't raised the scepter? What would have happened? That'd have been the end of her. I mean, he's not sitting left, obviously. You know, he's got guards and so on there. And so they all knew the rules, and she knew the rules too. But, you know, if he had not raised the scepter and indicated that he accepts her to come, to be there, then that would have been the end, of course, of her life. The scepter, of course, was and is still for kings, kind of a symbol of royal power. And most of them that you see are very ornamented with jewels and so on. I think, you know, I can picture the late Queen Elizabeth knighting somebody or whatever with a scepter. But there's another picture among all these that's been recovered from Persepolis, the palace in Persepolis, that's a likeness of Darius sitting, as a kind of a side depiction of him sitting on the throne with a scepter in his right hand. But this one it has some kind of swirls on it and so on, but it was not ornamented in much like what we see these days. But no doubt it's exactly the same thing that Xerxes had here. But it was certainly a symbol of power, an indication of royal power, and had serious meaning. If it was not raised, she would have been gone. He says to her, what's in essence, this is interpreted different ways, translated different ways. What is troubling you? He knew something was up, right? Of course, we see him over and over again trying to get her to tell him, what is it? What's going on? What's up? And she said, he said, you know, obviously this is, you talk about finding favor, up to half of the kingdom. Now, is that literal? Did he literally mean, you think, that he would give her half of the kingdom? Probably not. But do we remember? You remember an account in the New Testament of this a king saying this? That's right. This was, and Becky says correctly. This was King Herod had the daughter of Herodias dancing, you know, and this is another one of these banquets, right, so to speak. And she pleased him, and so he said to her, you know, I'll give you whatever you wish, up to half of the kingdom. She went in and talked to dear old Mom, and Mom was upset Herodias was upset with John the Baptist because he had said that these two shouldn't be married, that Herod had no right to be married to her. So she asked for the head of John the Baptist. Anyway, so that's another time this was used, and has probably used many times through the ages as hyperbole, really, just to kind of saying, you know, whatever you want, ask for what you want, and I'll give it to you. And no doubt, of course, a huge relief for Esther here, because things are certainly now going her way. It's interesting to hear her banquet was already prepared. That's confidence, isn't it? You know, and she couldn't keep the king waiting. She couldn't say, if the king's going to come and Haman's going to come, she couldn't say, oh well, now we'll have to go shop and got to go to the market and get a few things and so on. Got to have that ready ahead of time. So it's just interesting that she's got everything prepared and ready, and of course, she herself was prepared, and we'll be discussing this. But she herself was prepared in a way with a plan that she didn't just go in here just blindly. You know, she knew what she was going to do ahead. I wonder if maybe she had consulted with some. She could have, you know, we're not necessarily told every single, we know we're not told every single detail by any means of what goes on. Whether she counseled with Mordecai further or with others, you know, she had people about her. She may have talked to others about some of this, or she she may just decided on her own, but it was obviously a very effective approach that she did to this. Why didn't she just immediately go in? That's a bit of a big question. Why didn't she just immediately go into the king? The king says, "What's troubling you, my queen?" And she could have said, she could just have come out with it, right? And said, "This bad Haman is about to kill me and my cousin Mordecai and every Jew in the kingdom," and so on and so on. But would the king have been ready to hear that right now? No, he wouldn't have been, would he? He wouldn't have been ready. Again, I keep quoting Dr. Weirby, but his question was, why didn't Esther immediately inform the king about Haman's evil plot? And he says, for at least 4 reasons. For one thing, it wasn't the right time, and that's what I was just sort of alluding to. The king was unprepared to receive the shocking news that his number 1 officer was a scoundrel, he says. He probably, I really already knew that, but honestly, but he didn't know to what extent what all this is going on. In the midst of kingdom business, Ahasuerus Xerxes might have considered her accusation an act of treason, if not just a piece of palace gossip. But neither was it the right place, so not the right time, not the right place for her to intercede. And this is, I think, true and an interesting thought. There are no doubt retainers serving the king in the throne room, and it would have been a breach of palace etiquette for the queen to make her plea publicly. He says, the sight of a weeping, pleading woman before the throne might have annoyed the king and made matters worse. Better she should speak to the king in the privacy of her own apartment than in the throne room. The third reason was that Esther wanted Haman and only Haman present when she told the king about the plot. And so she obviously arranged that. But there was a fourth reason, one that Esther herself was unaware of at that time. And of course, that was that Mordecai had not yet been honored, right? And the king, that very night, but the king has to make his plans to honor Mordecai, and that sets the rest of this in motion. And he ended this little discussion by saying, in answer to prayer, God so worked in the king's heart that he not only cooperated willingly with his queen, but he also made Haman cooperate. Such is the wonder of the providence of God. Comments on any of that so far? Verse 5, the king obviously had many things he could have been doing. This comes in as a total surprise to him. But he rushed really to get himself and Haman to the banquet. And then, basically in verses 6 through 8, he's saying, again, why are we really here? What's really going on, Queen Esther? Tell me what you want. And again, he emphasized this about up to half of the kingdom. And she said what she really wanted is for them to come to another banquet. And he might have said, lady, I've got a kingdom to run here, right? I can't be coming in every night to a banquet. No, he didn't say that, not at all. One more banquet, one more day, she says, basically, verse 8, I will tell you. And basically the king says, no problem. That was basically his comment. On page 65 in your study book, you have it before you there, around the middle of the page, about a third of the way down within the paragraph, he comments on this. So why did she not make the petition known at the first? Did she think another day would make a difference? Did she believe the suspense would make him more favorable? Was she not concerned that Ahasuerus' patience might run out? Whatever the case, it seems Esther recognized more time was needed to convince King Ahasuerus to comply with her wishes fully. Making this point, Bush observed, Esther is not stumbling blindly in the dark, inexplicably inviting the king to two unneeded banquets. Esther is shrewdly and subtly pursuing a well-designed plan by which she has maneuvered the king into committing himself in advance. In a way, and that certainly is basically what is going on there. So now let's look at the final section of the text here. Chuck, would you read that for us, picking up with, what is that, verse 9? It begins the Haman. Isn't this an amazing snapshot into the life and the mind of this man? You know, he's, as we sort of said before about him, he's a little man in a very big position here. But you know, pride. If you want to put one descriptive word on him, about him, it would certainly have to be pride. And so he leaves the banquet just, you know, he's on an emotional high. He's just as happy and thrilled with himself and his situation until he goes by Mordecai. And Mordecai won't bow and scrape to him. And so that just ruins it all for him. He just can't stand it. And you know, just to pause on the point a little bit, there's a little bit of a lesson maybe for all of us in that, isn't there? You know, if we, if we can't be content with some negative circumstances in our own lives, then we got a big problem in a general sense, don't we? Because, you know, I mean, life has its issues, and you know, this is perhaps the whole. Certainly a major lesson that we can draw from the book of Philippians is that we can know joy, as it were, in the eye of the storm. We don't have to have everything. We never will have everything perfect. But in our relationship with God, we can be content, as the Apostle Paul was. You know, he wrote from prison. You know, he learned to be content with whatever his circumstances. And we can too with prayer and so on, but that's not going to come about by dwelling on negative things and find unhappiness in everything that doesn't just exactly please us, because there will always certainly will be one more thing that we might wish we had in a little bit better circumstances. But this man controlled himself, and I guess maybe the book author here said, but somebody else said, you know, probably that Haman didn't get where he was by just letting himself get out of control. So, I mean, he went on by. He didn't do anything right then. But then he went home. He went home to Mama, right? He went home to his wife and he had to gather all these people to boost his ego, right? He had to get his friends in, had to get his wife. He had to get them to soothe him. And then he went through and all of his accolades, everything that he had, what the king had done for him and so on. And I'm sure his quote-unquote friends, and perhaps they were counselors too, but I'm sure they were probably thinking, oh no, not again. We have to list this guy. We've no telling how many times they've had him recount all of his possessions and everything. But so they had to listen to all of it. And so they did. They went through all of it with him. But he said, as Chuck read just a minute ago, verse 13, yet all of this does not satisfy me, the New American Standard says. Every time I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate, then that just ruins it for him. So, now, his wife, Zeresh, and these folks with him, this is a tough crew, right? I mean, this is a hard-hearted bunch of people, right? So, if hopefully if somebody asked one of us, what's it going to take to make you happy now? They wouldn't say, go kill them, right? Go kill somebody that you're unhappy with or something. But, of course, he's in position. He thinks he is anyway, and was, for the moment, maybe, to have made this happen. But so he built this, 75-foot or whatever tall gallows, and he hadn't done it yet, but this pleased him, made him happy. He said, oh, we'll do that. And so he went away merrily, cheerfully, to the banquet, as happy as that evening, the second banquet, just happy as can be. And Jason teaching next week, I believe, isn't it? Right? So he's going to cover the next phase of this, but he's got there's things that he thinks this is going to take care of it for me. One interesting little detail here is there is some indication from some historical records that this wife Zeresh was the daughter of, and we'll see that not about anything else about her, but from Ezra later, the book of Ezra later, about this Tatnai, who was the governor beyond the river, as they call it, and he's the one that he sent a letter to the king asking him about these people rebuilding the temple. And of course the king back and said, leave them alone, they're doing what I've given them permission to do. But there's indication that this Zeresh is his daughter, that she's the daughter of the governor, Babylonian governor of the territory, quote unquote, beyond the river, beyond the Euphrates River, which of course included Jerusalem and that territory. So we'll eventually come back to that. So we might say his smile returned for the moment, but it wasn't going to last very long. Let's look at the applications here on page 67 in your book briefly. Esther's example of courage is worthy of both appreciation and imitation. Although she was aware of the danger associated with approaching King Ahasuerus' throne uninvited, she did not put off doing what was necessary. As Christians, there are times we need to have similar courage. We especially need the courage to speak up in defense of the truth when it is being attacked, and in defense of the church, and that obviously means us, the people, when it's being besmirched. Let us remember that God is on our side. Second, the calculated way Esther approached the king with her request is likewise noteworthy. Jesus instructed his followers, therefore be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Esther's actions were certainly prudent. We can learn from this. Even if our message is true, we must present it in the appropriate way. Truth should not, he says, truth should not always be used like a hammer to beat individuals into submission. Does that mean that it should sometimes be used as a hammer? No, I would say not, right? Truth should never be used as a hammer to beat individuals into submission. Had Esther approached King Ahasuerus and demanded the Jews' deliverance, things might have turned out differently. Her cautiousness, however, led to a great, great victory. And I would say, rather than her being cautious, there is cautiousness, but that's not the primary thing here. I would say it's strategic. It was strategy. She was working a strategy here to help to achieve an end that she desired. Number 3, Haman's decision to hang Mordecai illustrates the way many people in the world approach things that make them unhappy. Esther, rather than adjusting his attitude, Haman determined to eliminate Mordecai. Besides being immoral, this approach failed to recognize that happiness does not result from eliminating challenges, but from responding to them in the appropriate way. Until we realize we cannot control how others act and only how we react, we will never truly be happy. This Genesis 9:6, of course, it said, whoever sheds the blood of man by man, his blood shall be shed. But, of course, government is an exception to that, is it not? Properly done, any government, the governments are ordained of God, and they have the right to do this. This guy obviously was doing it for a very and entirely wrong reason. So the discussion question, just quickly, a couple minutes left here. On page 68. What can we learn from Esther's willingness to approach King Ahasuerus? What can we learn from that? Had to be accomplished. Mission had to be accomplished, Sarah said, and she had the courage to do it. She had the courage to do it. And she had the faith, I would say, along with the courage. And the second one, why did Esther proceed so cautiously? I'd commented on that. I would say she proceeded systematically. There was caution involved with it. What does Mordecai's example teach us about the influence of one individual? It can be critical, right? And the thing about it is with all of us, and we're not going to approach a king or whatever, probably, but all of us at times are in unique positions, maybe to influence for good, to influence somebody for good, or things of that nature. We all have our own relationships with people that's different than anybody else. And so, who knows but what I have come here, we could say, one might say, for such a time as this, as was said, as Mordecai said to her. Now, this is a biggie here. We're not going to solve this one here because if the second bell hadn't rung, I'm sure we would get number 4 completely solved. What is the source of happiness? I'm joking, of course. What must we do to maintain happiness as we face difficulties? Anybody got a one-sentence thing about what it takes to? Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I don't have any better than that. There's so many components, but I mean, it is. But well, I for one, are you saying you have you gotten more patient? Would you say, Brother Bill?
Well, probably some.
Yeah. She said, Johnny says he has. Yeah, well, I certainly didn't. Mona's raising her eyebrows over here. But I certainly, time has taken care of some of that, a lot of that with me. But happiness, again, I mentioned the book of Philippians a while ago. True happiness, in a way, has to be separate from circumstances, doesn't it? I mean, we cannot, circumstances alone, I mean, winning the lottery is not going to make anybody truly happy. That's going to bring a high, you might say, like Haman did going to the banquet here, but that is not going to be a sustainable thing. So, well, thanks everybody. I appreciate the discussion. My pleasure. My pleasure, as they say.